Hi everyone, my name is Koryn. So for the first question, it says, even if a person knows that he or she doesn't mean to discriminate against members of a particular group, does the person have a responsibility to potential listeners not to use biased language? I put yes. Any person, regardless of whether they mean to discriminate against another person or members of a particular group, has the responsibility to potential listeners to not use biased language. This is because each person's understanding of what the intended message is going to vary. Just because one person or the initial receiver of the message doesn't find the language offensive, that doesn't mean that someone else that might just be in the area but not necessarily part of the conversation, or even somebody that is part of the conversation, they might find it offensive. And everyone should have a certain amount of consideration for others when they're trying to relay a message. You also don't know if others are still kind of working through their own biases. So your language may give the impression that it is okay to be discriminatory towards certain groups if you don't censor appropriately. And you also risk isolating those within minority identities unintentionally by using uncensored language. Number 2, what is your responsibility if you hear someone using derogatory, biased language? Should you speak up and confront someone about his or her language? The correct thing to do in an ideal world, it would be to speak up and confront someone when they're using derogatory or biased language. However, you don't really know how a person is going to react when you're confronting them. You aren't always required or safe enough for yourself to be brashly confrontational when you're faced with those kinds of microaggressions or discriminatory language. However, if you don't do anything, that can do just as much harm. Something as simple as checking in with the person who identifies with the group that's facing the discriminatory language, or reporting it to somebody that's maybe higher up or has more power than you to do something, or saying something small but intentional like, what do you mean by that, are all ways to ensure that you're contributing to a culture of inclusion and not perpetuating harm. Then number 3 says, can you think of examples of language that is still in need of changing because of potential bias? My first example, where I'm from, there are still some people, mostly the older generation, who use the word negra to describe their family member or a friend whose skin color has turned darker after being out in the sun all day. Maybe they're at the beach or the pool, or they were just doing some yard work. I've even had people here in the States tell me, oh my gosh, you got so dark, when I've returned from visiting my island. Although I know that there was no malicious intent in the message, the word itself and its history that's rooted in racism likely will offend other people who have been discriminated against because of the color of their skin. It invokes thoughts and feelings that darker skin tones are inferior to their lighter counterparts. My example 2, excuse my language, but I've heard this a lot. When somebody says, like, don't be a pussy, or grow some balls, or grow up hair, a lot of people still use these phrases nowadays. Both phrases are primarily utilized by men. However, women do use these phrases as well to some extent. And it's used to describe like the masculine and feminine. However, this is sexist, and it's actually quite vulgar as it uses female and male genitalia to describe a person. It views the feminine as something weaker, more afraid, more inferior to the masculine, and it also aims to promote more masculine aspects within a person. So I believe that that actually is something that should change because it is quite biased. And my third example is the phrase, that's so ghetto. This phrase actually roots itself in classism, and it's typically used to describe anything that seems dirty or disgusting or lower class, and it also insinuates that whatever or whoever does not belong. When it's said about people, it ostracizes them by making them feel as if they don't belong or they're not welcomed in a particular community. The word ghetto itself is also inherently racist, especially in America, as it came from the segregation of immigrant communities and African Americans. So those are all my 3 examples of phrases or words that are still being used today that probably should be changed, just because they are quite biased and they're actually quite offensive if you think about it. All right, thank you so much.